Today, we're taking a fresh look at one of the most famous and honestly most heavily debated passages in all of biblical literature, Psalm 91. If you've spent any time in religious circles, you've definitely heard this ancient poem. But today, we're not just reading it. We're going to break it down, analyze the original language, and figure out exactly what this text meant to the people who first heard it, and what it's really saying about the nature of divine safety.
Just listen to this intense imagery for a second. You shall not fear the terror of the night, nor the arrow that flies by day. 1,000 may fall at your side and 10,000 at your right hand, but it shall not come near you. I mean, wow. The stakes established here are just sky high. The author is painting this picture of absolute, total chaos. We're talking unseen night terrors, deadly arrows flying around in broad daylight, and just catastrophic ruin everywhere you look. It's a genuinely terrifying, apocalyptic scene of vulnerability. So that naturally brings us to a really pivotal question, right? Does this text actually guarantee that believers will never experience physical harm? For centuries, people have treated this passage almost like a magic spell, like an ironclad guarantee of physical safety and immunity from life's tragedies. But is that actually what the text is saying? Let's do a little textual investigation and peel back the layers of this ancient poem to find out its true meaning.
Section 1. The promise of protection.
To really get what's being promised here, we can't just project our modern anxieties onto the text. We have to step into the historical reality of the original audience. They lived in a completely unpredictable, highly dangerous world. Ancient Israel constantly faced severe threats that were totally out of their control. We're talking invading armies sweeping across their borders, sudden disease outbreaks, famine, wild animals, and the constant looming shadow of massive empires like Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon. So when they read about arrows and pestilence, they weren't speaking in metaphors. These were literal, everyday existential threats.
But here's the thing. The enemies described in Psalm 91 actually operate on two levels. Yes, they are literal dangers, but they're also symbolic representations of basically every force that opposes life under God's covenant. By specifically calling out the visible dangers of daylight and the hidden terrors of the night, the author is summarizing the entire spectrum of human vulnerability. It encompasses literally everything that stands against God's rule.
Let's move to Section 2, Decoding the Ancient Hebrew.
This linguistic investigation is where things get really fascinating. To grasp the nuance of this protection, we have to look at the original words. Take the Hebrew word yoreh, which translates to fear. The very first command in verse 5 isn't, hey, don't worry, there's no danger. No, the command is, do not fear. This specific root distinguishes between a sinful, paralyzing fear of your circumstances and a holy, reverential fear of God. The text is basically saying that fearing God removes our slavery to fearing creation. The danger might absolutely still be there, but the crippling fear of it is neutralized.
Next up is pahad, meaning terror. This specifically describes an overwhelming fear that completely paralyzes a person, like unexpected horror or sheer panic. So the crucial takeaway is that the righteous aren't promised a life totally free of frightening events. Instead, they're promised freedom from being enslaved and paralyzed by panic when those terrifying events inevitably happen.
Then we have the word machsheh, which means refuge. Now, in our modern world, if I say refuge, you might picture an underground bunker, right? But in this biblical text, a shelter describes deep covenantal dependence. It's not merely about physical protection. This kind of refuge is incredibly relational. It's about depending on a person rather than just hiding out in a fortified location.
And that brings us to ma'al, or dwelling. This means a habitation, an abiding place, or a permanent residence. Highlighting this word reveals a massive paradigm shift. Think about it. God isn't being described as a hotel you merely visit when you're in a crisis. He's presented as a home to be inhabited permanently, day in and day out, regardless of the weather outside.
Now, what's really interesting is when we synthesize these words and look at their covenant significance, a really clear pattern emerges. The vocabulary consistently and overwhelmingly prioritizes a relationship with God over sheer immunity from earthly hardship. It's about freedom from dread, making God your actual home and trusting in His preservation. It's definitely not a magical spell to avoid all earthly pain.
Section 3. The covenant condition. It is absolutely vital to understand the conditional nature of this psalm. The verses we've been looking at aren't just isolated promises floating in a vacuum. They're deeply embedded in a broader covenant relationship. We see this condition clearly stated in verses 9 and 10. Because you have made the Lord, who is my refuge, even the Most High your dwelling place, no evil shall befall you. But hold on, we need to pause on that word evil. To understand it here, we have to interpret it canonically, meaning in the context of the whole Bible. Faithful servants like Job, the apostles, and Christ himself suffered immensely, right? So in this context, evil means ultimate covenantal ruin and eternal separation from God. It doesn't mean a complete absence of physical hardship.
Our source text outlines this beautifully by breaking down biblical protection into 4 dimensions. It's comprehensive. First, there's spiritual protection, meaning no one can snatch a believer from their ultimate security in Christ. Second, moral protection, being preserved from stumbling into ultimate sin. Third is eternal protection, the promise that absolutely nothing separates the believer from God's love. And finally, providential protection, meaning God either physically rescues a person from suffering or he gives them the grace to sustain them through it. Notice how that extends way beyond just physical safety into ultimate eternal security.
Section 4, Jesus and Psalm 91.
Now let's jump to the New Testament climax of this text, because this specific psalm was famously misused during one of the most critical moments in the Bible, the wilderness temptation. Satan literally tempts Jesus to throw himself off the temple by quoting Psalm 91, claiming the angels will catch him. But look at the stark difference between faith and presumption here. Satan intentionally left out the phrase, "to guard you in all your ways," which implies the path of obedience. He was tempting Jesus into presumption, but Jesus refused to manipulate God like that. He knew that true protection goes hand in hand with faithful obedience to God's will, not recklessly testing him or demanding an intervention just to exalt oneself.
And this brilliantly illustrates the larger framework across the entire redemptive historical arc. You see, Psalm 91 isn't just a random standalone poem. It is deeply tied to a massive biblical story. It starts in Eden, where humanity dwells safely with God, no fear at all. Then the fall happens, bringing fear and death into creation. Through Israel, God preserves his people covenantally, like we see in the Exodus. Then we get to Christ, the perfectly obedient Son, who is the only one to perfectly fulfill and embody Psalm 91. And because of that, the church shares in those promises through union with him, all looking forward to the new creation, where every single enemy is abolished forever.
Section 5, From Anxiety to Abiding.
So, now that we understand the deep theology here, how does this practically transform a believer's inner life and address those crippling daily fears? Well, the crucial point is kind of like a lighthouse standing on a jagged, rocky coast during a raging, violent storm. That lighthouse doesn't have the power to stop the relentless storm, right? It can't calm the waves. But what it does do is provide an unshakable, immovable place of safety and orientation right in the middle of the chaos. God doesn't promise a storm-free life, but rather his secure, unchanging presence to help you endure it.
Which leads us to this final, incredibly powerful realization. God's greatest promise is not merely protection from danger, but his abiding presence through every circumstance. The refuge is the Lord himself. Ultimately, for the believer, their life is hidden with Christ. The goal isn't just escaping the world, but deepening communion with him. And as that communion deepens, those everyday earthly fears, they slowly lose their mastery and their grip on the human heart. So, I'll leave you with this deeply personal question to close out our explainer today. Where do you instinctively seek your security? When the arrows fly and the storms rage in your own life, are you putting your confidence in fragile things, like circumstances, bank accounts, or temporary safety? Or does this ancient text challenge you to relocate your confidence to something or someone entirely unchanging? It's a profound thought to chew on today. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you next time.